Right, so yeah, museums, power and decolonisation is the title. And as Rob hinted at, there is the connection between these two subjects is intimate, between decolonisation and power. And as I hinted at last week in talking about Frantz Fanon, one can't happen without the other. But I just wanted to, before going on talking about power and how I'm going to understand it with you, just to say what I mean by this term decolonisation, because I think there's been a bit of revisionism, the way that the museum sector has adopted this word and how it, how we translate the meaning of it, because it's not an easy translation. For me, decolonisation really is related to situations where a foreign power has occupied a territory belonging to another country, and where it's being, and where the subjects of the people in that country are subjects to that foreign power, either economically, politically, or both, right? And so I just want to ask people to consider what we're doing when we apply this term to the museum context, because quite clearly, so Bristol Museum, we're not in the situation of, say, an African country that's being occupied by a foreign power, but this is an institution within Britain, and what we're saying is that we're making, I would say, an analogy in a way between what would happen, for example, the country where I was born, which was a colony of Britain, and we got independence in the 60s, and the country belonged to us. Now, I'm just asking people to consider that that particular process cannot happen without also addressing power. How do, power over the economy, over who works in the country. It involves economics, it involves human rights, it involves lots of things, actually, in terms of addressing power imbalances. So I just wanted to stress that, because I think that sometimes the way that this word decolonisation is used is perhaps, for example, let's talk, that simply somehow the act of talking about the colonial past in itself is decolonisation. And what I'd like to stress today, and this is why we're talking about power specifically, is that the analogy that we can take from the foreign occupying situation is that decolonisation cannot happen without the power relations being changed. If power relations remain the same, it cannot be decolonisation. It can't just be that we're, so, to go back to the analogy of the nation state, during the period when Jamaica was talking to Britain about becoming independent, that was not in itself decolonisation. Decolonisation was the moment when Britain left and the institutions of the country were handed over to the local population. So, as I said, the transition of that analogy is not smooth, because we're not dealing with an identical situation. But I think that there are some facts that we can transfer, such as the change of power, the change in who runs the country or the institution, and the rights, if you like, of the people within the organisation. So I just wanted to make that clarification before moving on to just give you what we're going to discuss. So I want to propose to you, in terms of it discussing the concept of power, Michel Foucault. I'll go into this. He is a philosopher that is most concerned with power. And I think that his ideas about power, which I'm going to go into in a bit, would be most useful for the museum context, because he is the great philosopher, or was the great philosopher, of institutional power. And so I wanted to actually just after outlining Foucault's ideas, is to offer you some perspectives on power in relation to museums in terms of the space, the architectural space, the symbolism of the space, curatorial power, and the power of interpretation, and finally, possession itself, possession of objects. Okay, so that's the plan. And I'm not going to really offer solutions with this. I want the discussion at the end to be a two-way dialogue where we can discuss this about how we might approach changing power relations in terms of these different areas. So let's just start with Foucault. Forgive me if people, those of you who are into Foucault or know his work, but I just wanted to give some context of the range of his work. He died, I think, in 1984, but he was writing from the late 50s, early 1960s. And these are the range of the books that he's written, and they're all to do with power and knowledge, which I'll go on to a bit. But, you know, he starts off talking about madness and civilization and the way that the concept of madness or mental illness is formed, and how the institutions that grow up to actually what he calls, he says, that actually confine madness. He is the great philosopher of knowledge, and the next book, you know, The Birth of the Clinic, is about medical, the rise of medical knowledge, and how that in itself constitutes a field of power in what he calls the human sciences. And the next book, The Order of Things, is about the human sciences: psychology, psychiatry, anthropology. And his big theory really is that the 18th century is a pivotal time for the rise of certain types of knowledge and also certain types of institutions. And in the archaeology of knowledge, he talks about how knowledge is classified, how we classify things, how we order the world, how knowledge or scientific disciplines are a way of ordering the world. And in Discipline and Punish, he talks specifically about prisons and the change in the judicial system from the 18th century, where different types of punishment and the different types of penal institutions and juridical systems are formed, that come into place in order to control crime. And his final works here, The History of Sexuality, talks about how the different ways that we've understood sexuality, and what he talks about, the government of the body, if you like, from classical times up to the modern period. But the one thing actually that he doesn't really go on about is museums. But I think that his work is ideally suited to museums. And the reason why I think it's suited to museums is the way that he talks about power and knowledge being intimately related. And this is why I wanted to offer you today that an understanding of power, that this power that we need to deal with in order to decolonize, how we can understand it. And what I find most striking about Foucault is the way he talks about power. He challenges this idea that people have power. He says that power isn't a substance that can be possessed. You know, people talk about having power or holding power or giving it up. He offers an understanding of power that it's not only related to knowledge, but it's something that he prefers to use the word exercise. So it's a dynamic relationship between subjects, between systems of knowledge, and it's the dynamic between those things that creates power. So he talks about discourse as being, and I'll go on to try and define these terms a bit better for you, that discourse being the context in which knowledge is formed, and that the power derives from the interaction of these discourses with institutions and with the individuals who work in those institutions. And he also talks about, he uses this term governmentality, and by governmentality in relation to knowledge and power, he's not talking about the organs of the state, the three branches of the state, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. By governmentality, what he's saying is that institutions, so we can say hospitals, prisons, and museums, that the power that they exercise forms a type of governmentality. So it's a power over individuals, over the way we do things, over the way we understand things. He talks about, so governmentality is part of the way in which we order society. So you might not consider museums as governmentality, but in terms of power and knowledge, that's what he is talking about. So going back to these terms that I've been using, discourse, and discourse is what we're involved in today, but it's also the professional discourses that you're involved in your various disciplines. And discourse is the totality of utterances that are both spoken and written within a specific discipline. So museology, it could be anthropology, it could be conservation. And what he calls a discursive formation is a term that describes all of the regular communications, whether written or spoken, that actually make up that discourse. And so large bodies of knowledge, such as political economy, criminal justice, natural history, medicine, as I've mentioned, the ones related to museology, are what he calls systems of knowledge. And the power that he talks about derives and is intimately related to these bodies of knowledge. Yeah. So to sum that up, what he says is that there is no power relation without a correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, and conversely, there is no form of knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations. So, as I've said, it's a dynamic system where practices of textual production, their transmission, how we consume those texts within professional disciplines, how they form the discourse, how they govern our relationship not only to objects, but subject positions. Now, subject positions, it's me as an individual. I see myself as a Black man living in England. Well, my subject position is to do with my identity, but that this identity is determined by the prevailing discourse. I can't get away from that. If I walk into a museum and I go into the British Museum, my subject position is determined by what I see. So when I go into the museum and I see that Egypt is not in Africa, but is spoken about as the ancient Near East, this affects my subject position, and therefore, and going round, it also determines the power relations that I have. So using that as a kind of framework, how could we use that to think of the statements that museums make in terms of power and in terms of knowledge and so on. Now, you know where this is. It's the British Museum. But I wanted to actually stress this, that the building, the architectural structure is the first point of this power-knowledge relationship, which is sending a message to me about my subject position, and it is a powerful statement. So the British Museum, the facade here it's making gestures about classical knowledge. It's talking about this kind of imperial architectural statement is talking about systems of learning to do with classicism, and it's also a national statement. You know, this is the British Museum, but it could well be a local. Let's not just say that. You know, we've got the local state as well, that museums locally make authoritative statements in their architecture, and when one encounters this, it is making it is a power relation. So when I walk through this portico, I'm encountering a powerful system of knowledge that is being communicated to me through architecture. But not just that. There's another writer called Kevin Hetherington. He's very much influenced by Foucault, and he talks about how the museum space itself is a place for regulating behavior. So once I walk through these porticos, I'm submitting to a type of behavior, a system of behaviors, some of which are allowed, some of which are not allowed. The way, the volume at which I can speak, my physical gestures in walking around, how I look at objects, that this is a power relationship that's being set up. So the museum space is one where behavior is regulated. And Kevin Hetherington talks about how the rise of the museum, the British Museum in 1750, these in the 18th century, and the 19th century, these institutions were the great organs that help to regulate behavior, to regulate the public, to behave in a certain way and to perform in a certain way in relation to culture. So to decolonize these spaces, we have to think about not only what they look like, but what's allowed within them. We need to change what is allowed in them. And I know that a lot of museums are trying to do this with having late events and so on, but we can go much further. And when we have the discussion, I'd like to hear your ideas about how we change this perception of the museum, this power dynamic that starts as soon as you walk into the door, that it's telling you that you've got a certain relationship to culture, to civilization, and to certain types of regulated behavior. The next area I wanted to flag up is the power of the curator, the power of connoisseurship. This is another relationship to knowledge, how we interpret works of art, what category we put them into, and upon whose authority can we do that. And what I think we've got at the moment is the dominance of curatorial knowledge based on art history, on European art history, on European interpretations of history, and that this is how the works of art are governed in their presentation. Now, to give you an example of this, some of you might have heard of, just before the lockdown, Tate Britain had a show called Baroque and Power, roughly the title. Interesting, the word power used there as well. And a huge row broke out because one of the paintings in the show depicted one of Charles II's mistresses with a number of child slaves around her. It's quite a distasteful portrait. And the painting had no contextual information about why it was there. There was a lot of controversy about it. And in the end, the Tate changed the label, basically. But what I would say in that even when they changed the label, the power of connoisseurship and curatorial interpretation, dominant interpretation, still had not been dealt with, just by relabeling the painting and saying that the Duchesse de Mazarin, who was the woman depicted in the painting with these child slaves, was connected with the slave trade. What it actually raised was the whole interpretation of the Baroque, and the particular period that they were talking about was the restoration of the monarchy in England and Charles II. Now, we walked to another room. There was another room in the show which had the architecture of Christopher Wren and the buildings that he made in Greenwich. And what became apparent to me was a failure to really interrogate slavery and empire and how it was related to the Baroque, and how it runs through different art forms, not just painting. So it doesn't mean the portrait of the Duchess is not the whole story. We need to look at the architecture of Christopher Wren, the Baroque, but also the spatial concepts of the Baroque, and how we can open that up and understand it in terms of what was happening in England at the time in terms of colonial expansion. So this was a classic instance of where the power of the dominant power of a certain type of curatorial expertise and interpretation was excluding other perspectives. And in fact, the show would have been much richer if another type of strategy could have been used to curate it. And so that's another area that I want to discuss with you later, which is how do we open up this expertise, this connoisseurship, which Stuart Hall talks about being the dominant way of governing how we look at artworks, the story of empire, the story of slavery, how it feeds through into art in terms of aesthetics, and how we can understand a context, for example, the Baroque. So I just wanted to show you another image of curators. These are citizen curators, and they're at is a regimental museum in Cornwall. And I know that you have this in Bristol, this Uncomfortable Truths project, which is a great start, I think, for looking at a concept of a curatorial strategy, if you like, that doesn't rely on the established ways of looking at art, which one is taught if one studies at the Courtauld Institute of Art or one of the established institutions, that there are other perspectives that we can bring to curating. And I also wanted to give you my understanding of this word, curator, which is such a fascinating word, because I think it's a word that has been somewhat hijacked by museums, and people have forgotten where it came from, and that curator, the word curator itself, has nothing to do with art or museums. It simply means somebody who looks after other people, actually, not objects. So if I used to work in the health service, and in social care, if a child is taken into care as a ward of court, between the time when the child is removed from their family and another home is found, that a person is appointed who is called a curator ad litem. And so this is the ancient meaning of curator. It simply means to look after it, not objects, but people. It's in the 18th century, the rise of museums, that the word starts to morph into looking after objects. And what I want to bring back is this humanitarian aspect of it, which is that curating is also about people. It's not just about objects. And I think that it's very exciting how we could have different perspectives on artworks and interpreting periods like whether it's Baroque or the period of the British Empire, but bringing in other people to reveal these uncomfortable truths. This is obviously brings us into interpretation and the systems of knowledge that we bring into interpretation. And I would say that in some ways there is a tyranny of interpretation. And in the mention of truth, in my previous slide, a word that Foucault uses about truth is regime. He talks about different regimes of truth, which I really like, actually, because a regime is a power system that is dominant. And so certain artworks, or certain periods, as I was mentioning about the Baroque, have a dominant interpretation attached to them. And I don't think there is one interpretation to any period or anything, actually. There are always multiple perspectives. And I think by opening up curatorial strategies, we can have these different interpretations. I went to a show a few years ago in Italy, in Florence, and it was about the history of money, right? And it was one of the most memorable exhibitions I've been to, because they got two different curators to write the interpretation notes. I actually find interpretation notes really annoying, actually, in a lot of museums, when you have these labels up and they're telling you from a person's perspective what this artwork is about, as if there is one interpretation of it. Well, the show that I went to, that was a wonderful place in Florence called Palazzo Strozzi, they had two different labels on the wall, and they contradicted each other every time. So they were painting. The paintings were about the representation of money in Renaissance art. So it's either in terms of, you know, coins or people, things that people transported money in, or the representation of money, for example, in the paintings of Botticelli, the way that fabrics used communicated wealth. Well, the labels were totally diametrically opposed, and these people were arguing with each other. They're having a conversation with each other. I thought that was wonderful, actually. So I think that, again, the power of interpretation, we can open it up and invite different perspectives and conflict. I think that the clash of ideas is a good thing, so that the public can get that notion that there are different ways to look at art, to interpret history. So the final thing I want to look at is the power of possession. We can't possess power, but we can possess objects, and the way we possess these objects is related to relationships of power. I was speaking to somebody from The Guardian this morning, and he was saying to me, can I imagine a situation where museums will deaccession objects or repatriate them? And I said to him, I can, but not right now, because the power system that we have is in favor of the continued possession of these objects. But this photograph, by the way, was taken in 1897, and it's members of the British Army with the items from the palace of the Oba in Benin, after they had sacked it and burnt it down. And you can see them there. And I think it's quite a chilling photograph, because I think the man in the middle with his hands folded, and then there's somebody on with a piece of paper, it looks like an inventory. It really gives you that raw feeling of possession, right? And I do know, and I was in the conversation I was having with this journalist, that this is an issue which will probably have to go to Parliament, and I'm not expecting necessarily that Bristol, well, if it doesn't go to Parliament, it certainly has to go to the City Council, because I'm aware of all the legalities around deaccessioning and possession of objects. But again, I really can't see, going back to that original definition that I offered you about decolonisation, about giving up territory or handing back responsibility to the population, how we can really move forward with decolonisation without this issue of possession being looked at. Now, I know that there are objects in the Bristol collection that we need to talk about, but I really do urge you to look at this. And we had a consultation with our trainees, our new museum school trainees, about the Black Lives Matter Charter that Culture And is going to publish, and the issue of repatriation of objects is in there. But when we consulted our trainees about this, what they also said to us is that in terms of the possession of these objects, they thought that, for example, the Benin bronzes that are in the British Museum, I know that there's only, I think you have one authentic one in Bristol, others are copies, but that the possession of these objects over such a long period has an economic price to it. And that really, we should be thinking, when we're talking about decolonisation and repatriation, we need to be thinking about the economics of it. And just to give you a really a positive example of this from Glasgow. The University of Glasgow worked out how much economically it had gained from the slave trade, and I think they came to, I think the figure came to it was between 20 and 30 million. I can't remember the exact amount, and that a lot of it was related to Jamaica. And what they did is that they made those funds available to the University of the West Indies to start a research institute.
Oh, should we leave some? Sorry to interrupt you. Should we? We've got a little bit of space for questions.
Right.
Should we leave a little bit? Maybe
Yeah,
come back
so
on some points.
that's it. That's it.